Very good. Let's open it up. Let me just tell you what the rules are. Many hands going up. I'd like you to stand up, say who you use a microphone, say who you are, and either ask a question, but preferably say something. But please make it quite short, because although we have 50-odd minutes, it would be nice to have as many people joining in as possible. We'll start in the central block and then come to the periphery, starting 1, 2, 3, please. Yeah.
Gary Taylor. We worked together, Guy, a few years ago. I think the basic point I took from the initial talk was that jobs is the key, because you're saying the election trade-off bicycles and things, but people will always value a job because that's going to get them out of poverty, at least temporarily. And what's my own particular interest is using labour-based or labour-intensive technology, substituting for where we're using capital-intensive at the moment. And in 1996, I did a study in Zambia. We could create 5,000 jobs almost immediately in road maintenance. It was never taken up because why? Because the road ministry is interested in kilometres of road built. And by the time it's got through the government system, the money that it needs to do the roads, it's felt, well, we've no time now, let's get a contractor in quickly to build it. So, you get caught in this bind that the technology, we know some answers, but the systems sort of defeat us. So that's my main sort of point. We need infrastructure. Without spending any extra money, you can change what's been spent now from one technology to another and create short-term jobs. Of course, that doesn't lift them out of poverty forever, but at least there's multiplier effects from that.
If you were Vice President of Zambia, say, how would you implement this, and what kind of resistance would you expect to face?
Let's start with the second part. The resistance comes from the engineers you have in the the Roads Department, who I know quite well, and they're all very intelligent people. But it's a headache trying to do what I'm trying to describe, because it's not the way they normally do it. Maybe if you were in a more cynical view, you'd say there's less patronage from going in this route than you might get from employing big contractors. So I'd say you'd have to overcome that resistance within the ministry.
Okay.
Okay, I won't take much longer than that.
We'll take a few and then come back to you, if that's all right.
No problem.
Yes, please.
My name is Humphrey Harrison from E-Mediation. Dr. Scott, you mentioned that yesterday you were down in Canary Wharf and you went into the bankers and you cracked a joke. When you came out of that meeting, were you laughing or crying? Or put it differently, what perception did you leave with as to the extent to which the big money boys understand the issues in Africa? Because it's a problem I encounter again and again. They know the numbers, they know the macro story, but they have not the faintest appreciation of what you might be talking about when you refer to the social alienation, the desperation, the poverty in many parts of Africa, or the nature of the practical problems. What impression did they give to you?
Mrs. Thatcher used to say, don't give me problems, give me solutions. So what would you do about that?
Sorry?
What would you do
What would
to
I
solve
do?
that problem?
Which problem?
That people in Canary Wharf allegedly don't understand.
Ah.
The real Africa.
Well, how long have you got?
I've got 30 seconds for an answer.
30 seconds.
They are no quick answers.
Okay, all right, behind you.
Hi, thank you very much. Ben Phillips from Save the Children. NGO types like me and the new World Bank president often get a bashing from people like Lance Pritchett and Bill Easterly for obsessing about schools and hospitals and equity and cuddly things, when what Africa really needs is growth, growth, growth. How do you see the balance between equity and growth? And from what you've said, is equity making a comeback?
Well, there's a few things there to get your teeth in. Would you like to start with those?
Yes, I think the choice of going labour intensive is a very obvious one, but it's not simple, and I agree. I agree that the patronage is not there, the major thing. And of course, people have been sent to universities which have been teaching them capital intensive techniques. I mean, you should try getting agricultural researchers in Zambia or in Africa generally, to look into some of these new organic techniques like they're using in Brazil and so forth. They are not interested. They've been taught it's fertilizer, tractors, all the rest of it. And it can't be the solution to the agricultural development problem. So I agree, it's difficult, but I thank you for raising the point. Canary Wharf, I didn't get a totally negative view of that. I mean, once they realised that I was inclined to crack jokes, they laughed. Sometimes when I wasn't cracking a joke, right? But I mean, they sort of got into the spirit of things, and some of them I felt understood what we were trying to say, or got somewhere towards that. And the third question was?
About whether equity is making a comeback.
Yes, I think
social
equity.
welfare and
I think certainly growth hasn't done the job. I mean, the idea that GDP growth is going to provide the schools, provide the social welfare and so forth, especially the example of the mines. I mean, the mines are an example of two things. One is Gary's point about labour. I mean, you can't have labour-intensive open cast mining, it seems. You look down one of those holes, you see these vast machines that push you off the road on both sides, you know, if you meet them on the way to the mine. And you don't see any people down there except one little chap sitting in a cabin up on the top of one of these big dump trucks with a red button that he's supposed to hit if anything goes wrong. You know, meanwhile he's reading a comic. And it doesn't seem that you can change the technology and say, I'm going to put 1,000 people with wheelbarrows in there. It doesn't seem to work that way. And I think, likewise, the other thing that's now missing in mining that used to be present in mining, which is something which I think needs a retrospective study, is that we've got the best football team in Africa, possibly the world, because the mining industry gave it to us. I mean, that's all kids, or the immediate next generation of kids, who were raised in the welfare halls, and they had professional coaching at football and so forth, because their parents were working on the mines. So there was at least a coupling of some sort between the benefits to the population as a whole in terms of social welfare and you know, productive investment. Now, the copper belt itself looks like a ghost town, while it's got the highest copper prices ever experienced in the history of the commodity. And it's difficult. I mean, of course we want education, of course we want health, of course they're priorities, but it seems to be, but we're still getting pushed by this paradigm which, and I mean, what do you do when the governor of the Bank of Zambia considers it his duty to pay himself more than $1 million a year? What do you expect in the way of social welfare to take over? But yeah, I mean, I think that point is correct, to raise the issue that it's all GDP growth oriented, and it's supposed somehow to spin off what you're after, really after, and in fact it's not.
you take a company like Anglo American, who spend over $10 billion a year in their supply chain and have explicitly set out to make it more development friendly and pro-poor, for example by unbundling contracts, looking for small, medium-scale enterprises to supply it. And I have a question here from Lisa Horner from VSO, who says, what role do you think small enterprises can play in generating the level of jobs that are needed? And can we strengthen the wealth of micro to small enterprises already in existence?
I mean, only if you can get the interest rates down to something vaguely realistic. I mean, if you've got commercial banks giving commercial loans at 25% in real terms, what do you imagine microfinance loans are going at? They're going at things like 60 and 70%, because you've got to add all your spread for management of the loan on top of that and your risk. And I mean, I don't see how anyone's going to compete with anybody. It's at 60% or 70%.
And why is commercial money so expensive?
It's expensive because I think there is this short-termitis, this idea that we've got to get the money back or got to get our initial investment back within 3 years. And I think once and that's all connected to, my God, if I carry on walking around the tree, I'll meet an elephant that I wasn't expecting to meet, and my gun will jam. I mean, there's a general terror of the future, which I think has to be allayed.
There are one or two bankers I know in the room who might want to comment on that, but let's go to the peripheries. I think you had your hand up. Let's take three here first. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Thanks, Mwabwanji. My name is Nick Hall. I work for Plan International. I grew up in Zambia as well, in Mufulira. In fact, in those days of sort of cradle to grave mining company support to the whole system. I was going to talk about China. You know, I mean, in the early 60s, China was almost the sort of saviour of Zambia with building the Tanzam Railway. I won't quote you now about things you said before the election about China and Britain and India and so on, probably be embarrassing. But the fact is that China, the situation with the Chinese investment is quite tricky. There's environmental degradation, human rights issues, and so on.
Don't get so excited that you wave the microphone.
Sorry. I'm just wondering how you see things developing in future with the relationship with China and with investment from China, and in fact whether the situation you face in Zambia has got resonance for other countries in Africa as well. So I know this is a fairly hot topic.
Somebody else, you had your hand up.
Yeah. My name is Beth Achunda from TIE Fund. I just want to find out what your government is going to do differently from what has been done before in the area of corruption, because I remember President Mwanawasa also put corruption on as a priority, and there were so many efforts which were done, but afterwards it seems like it still continued. There was an attempt maybe to correct it, but it was still ongoing. And yeah, so now it's also again back on the agenda. So the question is it going to be different? Of course, one of the observations is that it's systemic. There is a tendency just to remove the top leadership, but then I think the truth is that it's a systemic problem.
It's a good first term topic we heard earlier. Yes, please. Yes, you. No, sorry, the gentleman in the glasses was next.
Thank you. My name is Nzita from DRC. Dr. Scott, I think defective Western democracy is another bad product the Washington consensus has sold to Africa, when China has done quite a comprehensive market research on that democracy, and they said, no, I'm not going to buy this product, it's bad. As an example, let's look at the Hindu economic growth and China. Everyone in the West is saying India has done very well, 2% Hindu growth rate. But if we will look at the initial condition of India in comparison to China, the initial condition of India in comparison of many of the African countries, India has not done very well indeed. 2% is nothing if you compare it. So if we go to the 80s, the newly industrial countries, they did not develop with democracy. Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and you name it. Going back to the 19th century, Europe did not develop with democracy since the beginning of European Revolution in 1850. Germany, France, England, you name it. Democracy for Africa, probably, I think it is a bad product. Why? You can't think at long term. It is like someone working in the city. What he sees, short term.
Okay, good point
Thank
to
you.
stop. And I'm sure David will want to comment on that as well. Felicity.
Yes, thank you. Felicity Proctor, independent consultant. I would just like to ask one question, really about the time frame for the sort of economic transformation in Zambia. If we're talking about new sectors, whether service sectors, industrialization or whatever, and their capacity to absorb the large number of unemployed, and a number which will actually be increasing into the next generation in all parts of sub-Saharan Africa, including no doubt Zambia. Given that context, how do you see the role of agriculture, in particular small-scale agriculture, as a viable employer for this youth dividend that you have at the moment, and what's the transformation is taking place? And do you see some structural change in small-scale agriculture which would make it a more viable opportunity for young people as a source of employment?
Okay, very good. Answer them all or pick and choose.
China, yes, we said nasty things about China, and I think some of them were justified. I mean, when you have a management team of a coal mine shooting at its workers admittedly with birdshot. I mean, only number 6 or something. They don't going to kill anybody. But I mean, it indicates as poor management theories anyway. I think poor management system, and then of course no witnesses turn up at the court, which is another indication of poor governance in the legal system. I think you're entitled to make a noise and say this has to improve. And we've certainly had a lot more understanding from China since the Chinese government, since that time, or since we won the election. They withdrew one ambassador and replaced him with another one. I was in China the other day. I mean, it's very interesting. They have a machine for dealing with African leaders. It consists of a huge stretch limousine that they pick you up with at the airport, and they drive you down the main drag there, the 6-lane highway, and take you past the Forbidden City and turn you left into Tiananmen Square and then into the Great Hall of the People, where they say how they've always been on our side and how they've always been PF supporters. And if you want serious agreement with them, you have to go back to the time of Sun Yat-sen, which is where we were all multi-party Democrats and we all got rid of the empire. But I think right now we don't have a problem with China. The lady Bertha, corruption is a very good point. Let's see how far we manage to go. But I mean, we are prepared, and I think we understand in a way that previous governments haven't understood, that a lot of the problem is at the level of director type level in the civil service, not the top levels. It's the people who've been in place too long and have become too much inhabitants of that particular underground sort of system. And I think you can expect us to declare war on them fairly soon and fairly grievously. The DRC, I didn't quite follow the case, but I wonder whether the DRC itself is a good example of development inspired by a lack of democracy. I don't know. I mean, how many countries do we have to take, and on what basis do we choose them before we can examine a statistical relationship between lack of democracy and economic growth?
I mean, there are a few analyses of that, but I think, in relation to David's point, I mean, the question is, these hard things you need to do, are they more difficult to do if you're accountable to electors?
Well, that would tend to follow, yes. I mean, but I mean, does that mean that whoever happens to be in charge should suddenly draw an end to elections and say, right, we're the guys who are going to make this work? I think history has a more complex dynamic than that.
Would you like to comment on that point before we come to small scale?
Yeah, I mean, the thought that we have is, I mean, it is true in some important respects that multi-party democracy has been sort of foisted on Africa by different other parts of the world which did not develop on the basis of democracy. But now that that's happened, you clearly have to come to terms with the fact that there are multi-party systems in many African countries and the population likes it.
Well,
but then the question, I think, is how the more damaging effects of party competition could be mitigated. Which would, I mean, the possibility that might be pursued in the Zambian case is talking to the MMD at this point about some of the things you want to do, which they could undermine by making juicy short-term promises to the constituencies. In other words, start a debate about certain things being vital to Zambia's long-term interests as a country and therefore being too important to be the subject of short-term politicking, some sort of bargain with the forces on the other side of the fence about putting certain things out of the immediate political competition.
Which in the UK,
I mean, that's a question.
Climate change, we did that with
And we did it, and we do it with central banks. I mean, some countries take central banking out of the hands of party politicians for the very good reason that party politicians can't be trusted. There are lots of development challenges which could be treated in the same way. I mean, sort of big infrastructure, for example.
Well, it's a complex question. I mean, in '91, when as MMD we beat Kaunda's party, the UNIP, by 125 seats to 25 in Parliament, we had a massive majority, and one we could afford to even fritter away. And one of the downside was that with our massive majority, the infighting got out of hand. You'd feel like you get a knife or two in the back on an almost daily basis, because it didn't sort of matter for the parliamentary majority. On the other hand, it meant we could remove the subsidies from the maize market without thinking too hard about it, because the UNIP had such a walloping. Whereas recently, the September elections, we've actually got a very narrow margin, and it makes it good in the sense that there's no knives going in the back, but at the same time there's a certain amount of apprehension about changing things that maybe need to be changed. But I think it's far too complex an issue to treat as a simple kind of correlation exercise. And the question about capacity, small-scale farming, and so on and so forth, it depends whether we can get organized. I mean, the capacity in farming in Zambia is largely dependent upon the land tenure issues. If you've got no control over somebody who's farming, and he himself or she herself has no control over whether that land remains in their hands or gets handed on to some more influential person, you can hardly improve smallholder agriculture. You can't get people to lime their land, you can't get them to shape their land to make it more immune to erosion. You can't get them to produce high yields because it attracts jealousy on the idea that the land is better than other land. It's very, very difficult. Whereas if you can settle people and get them in some more orderly kind of structure, maybe we can do something. But I think that remains to be seen. I'll happily come back and talk about that in, let's say, 2 years. I'd have something to say. We haven't been through a single season yet.
I do think this comes to the heart of what we want to talk about in the remaining half hour, which is actually what are the 6 big things you want to get done in Zambia and what might be the political constraints to doing them. We haven't had any questions from this side, so we'll take 3 or 4 over there, starting with Andy and then moving across the front row. Andy Norton.
Charlotte, 6 big things.
Thanks very much, Andy Norton, ODI. Just building on that quickly, one of the things that's obviously in the news a lot at the moment with Africa is the wave of large-scale commercial land acquisition, particularly from external actors. And a lot of the policy focus is on sort of social responsibility approaches from the corporates, sort of responsible acquisition guidelines, voluntary guidelines on land. From the point of view of African governments, what do you think are the key things to be done in the next couple of years to produce the best possible outcomes from this change in the landscape?
Very good. Just while the microphone's there, Anne, do you want to say anything about the problem of, in general, banks lending to Africa?
No, we had our go this morning. Actually, we were one of the. Anne Grant from Standard Chartered, and we were one of the banks represented. And I hope we were laughing in the right place. But we, in fact, it's not the guys in our case. Both our CEO for Africa and our CEO in Zambia are women, and I think very aware of their broader responsibilities and very interested in more than just the bottom line. I think you're quite right. It's the pricing of risk. The commercial banks don't actually set the interest rate, but as I understand it now from in Zambia, the central bank is setting the interest rate at 9% from this month. And we and others will be complying with it. Let's hope it drives down the cost of borrowing. But I think you're right. It's linked to general perceptions of the country, the ratings of the country internationally, and the ability to raise money from external sources.
Okay, thanks. Who else was in the front row?
Yeah. Guys in Zambia is an ambidextrous word.
Peter Boulding from CIPFA, Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy. I put a plea in for consideration of one of the 6 planks to be a public financial management reform programme that really was extensive, not just in the Ministry of Finance, but well beyond that, into all the line ministries and other agencies and local government, particularly in line with the initial emphasis on anti-corruption. Because if you have a decent public financial management system, a lot of the corruption is just not going to be there. It's going to be pushed away by the strong internal controls and the like, which would be a firm foundation for everyday behaviour. and attach to that a good professionalisation scheme that actually embeds that in the way that people think about things. And also put in a plea for perhaps more public sector employment as part of the whole thing, because we're seeing the impact of here in terms of austerity, but an anti-austerity program for Zambia might be part of that solution too. So a couple of things to think about there.
Okay, thanks. And next you.
Hi, I'm David McNair from Save the Children. And Dr. Scott, when you came to office, President Sata made some fairly strong statements on the mining sector and willingness to revisit badly negotiated contracts and so on. I wanted to ask you about balancing the issue of Zambia getting a fair price for its copper with this issue of investment climate and how Zambia is perceived as a place to invest.
Okay, and we'll take Fletcher one more.
I'm Fletcher Temba. I'm a research fellow here at ODI, but I also come from Malawi, which is neighborhood with Zambia. I wanted to revisit this issue of political contestation and accommodating alternative views, because to me that's where most of our governments miss a lot of potential for contributions from civil society, private sector, because there is a lot more of the political front, us versus them, or the winner takes it all approach. And recently in Malawi, for instance, we've just seen, a former president who died, but then a new one coming, and then certainly a number of MPs from parties that were, including the one that was in government, wanting to shift to the one in power because they can't see any way of functioning and establishing their legitimacy with their electorates, because government means the ruling party. I wondered whether my VP, I would call him that, because, near Malawi, as I said, would say something a bit more of how he can characterize working with the civil society, working with the opposition, working with all these other players, in order to generate from ideas from Zambia, because ultimately it's Zambians who have a lot at stake, and I can say that there are a lot of knowledge now in Zambia that needs proper management, proper politics to get it out and make development happen.
All right, thank you all very much. Any comments on that?
No, I think the land grabbing point is very good. It's not as bad as I thought I was going to find it. I thought I was going to find, I know that people had made applications for sort of millions of hectares and so forth, but the previous administration hadn't handed the land out in a very slapdash way. Well, interestingly, I mean, there is a, when I arrived the other day from Lusaka, there was a company from mainland Europe wanting to have dinner with me and wanting to fly in from mainland Europe to have dinner with me to increase their holding of land and their investment in land in a new farming block. And I said no, because it's not my job to negotiate these things which are essentially commercial. And I left the people, I had people with me from the Ministry of Commerce who had gone up to Manchester today, and I said, you go ahead and deal with it in the proper way, and they didn't even come. So I think there is a lot of, let's see if we can persuade the Vice President to give us some land kind of stuff goes on, and with or without gifts of sort of iPads and iPhones, and what else do we get? Movie cameras, green tea.
Green tea shop, actually.
We've set up a shop with Chinese products. And it's an issue, there's no question about that. You do need a properly evaluated. There are a lot of chances turn up in Africa, as they turn up elsewhere, but I mean Africa, especially attractive place for certain types of speculator. And I think I've nearly seen it all. When I was Minister of Agriculture, I was visited by some people who, for $5 million, would plant jojoba beans for me in the Zambezi Valley where no rain was needed. And these beans would grow and harvest themselves and march to the bank and deposit themselves, as far as I could make out, because they were such a miracle crop. And I said, of course, no. And the next thing I knew, a president of a neighboring country, of which there are 8, so it was only one neighboring country, had announced to the public that he was going to grow yogurt trees, which was his interpretation of what a chochab bean was. But yes, there's a lot of nonsense goes on, and we have to have professional supervision of it, oversight of it. The interest rates, I'm pleased to hear that there's acknowledgement that the risk is overpriced. I mean, I've lived in Africa now for 67 years. I haven't seen this risk materialize, even at the height of scientific socialism, where we out-socialized the Soviet Union. We showed them things they didn't even think was possible. You know, life continued, and assets remained in people's hands, and profit opportunities were there. There was none of this kind of 3-year horizon showing itself. And I mean, now it's much, much better. And so thank you for that. And I say the point about guides is not that I mistook the agenda of any of your colleagues, but rather that I was using Zambian shorthand. Public financial management system, yes, I mean, there are several efforts in that direction going on, and I thoroughly agree with that. Mining concessions, I mean, I don't know, you get, what shall I say, we've got a very wide range of investors in the large-scale mining industry, copper mining industry. Some of them are Chinese, but not by any means the majority. Some of them are Indian, some of them are Swiss, and I can only say notionally Swiss because I can't really believe anyone set up a mining company in Switzerland in a substantive sense. Canadian, at least one Canadian company is run by people I was at school with in Zimbabwe, so it has to be Northern Rhodesians coming back under a different guise. I mean, there's a very wide variety of investors, and I'm sure they differ very much in terms of their attitude towards their obligations to pay tax and so on and so forth. The tax formula, which is often a subject of argumentation in Zambia, I don't think is what really worries us. What worries us is the compliance. We used to have, just to supervise Anglo-America, we used to have 2 very nasty former mining sector accountants in the Ministry of Finance, Richard Jolly would remember them perhaps, whose job was only to find today's loopholes in the presented accounts from the mining company. You know, and they were numerous. There were so many, they were like leaves in autumn. And it's very easy. I mean, you can overprice your capital inputs, you can underprice your sales, you can underestimate your quantities, your volumes, you can do all sorts of things. And I mean, I think we need the tax that is due. I don't think we need to adjust the formula, at least not at this stage. And I think any ideas, I mean, I've tried a lot of things, some of which I can't even tell you, to try and get into the sort of undergrowth and see what's happening. And it's not feasible. You're not getting cooperation from Western governments and so on and so forth. And I think it's something that we ought to start pushing on, even though it's going to take a long time, I would guess, to make. I mean, after all, you're getting tax evasion on a massive scale in Britain. So, you know, what are we supposed to do from Zambia with internet services that don't even work properly? And civil society pressure, it's interesting. I mean, people from one-party states like China come to Zambia and they're utterly amazed at the discourse that goes on in Parliament, where people are abusing each other, accusing each other of everything, and then going and all having a cup of tea later and having a good laugh over it. I don't think they understand the multi-party method of discourse, which is abuse followed by we're all jolly good fellows. And I think if we're not used to that discourse, it's very strange. I think it's very odd. I remember the Chinese ambassador or the Chinese first secretary bringing a visiting group to Parliament the other day, and they just sat there with their mouths wide open for about an hour while we accused each other of everything short of some things that shouldn't be mentioned.
All right, very good. I'd really like to try and get some help on this question of what are the solutions to Zambia's growth and development problem, and particularly the 6 big ideas. Mining generating lots of money, but perhaps causing some Dutch disease, you said earlier. I've got a question from somebody here. Keith Moody, ex-Zambian Airways Operations Director. What's the future for the Zambian aviation industry? And a new national airline would be a massive boost for the economy and the population. Let's just have a bit of a brainstorm. Remember my 2 axes, good administration and tough policy choices. What are the tough policy choices you'd like to see? Start with you and then we'll move across. Yes, can we have the microphone?
David Harrison from the International Development Committee in the House of Commons. We had the good fortune to meet you in Zambia, and as you know, the committee is doing an inquiry into DFID's programme in Zambia. And my question is about the abolition of the fertiliser and maize subsidy, and whether you think it will happen this Parliament, and whether DFID has any role in helping you achieve this. And we're taking evidence from the Stephen O'Brien in June, and is there any key question you'd like us to ask him?
Very good. So that's one big idea, abolish the maize and fertiliser subsidy. Yes? Have you got a big idea?
Not really. I'm going to abuse the privilege. Alistair Fraser, University of Cambridge. I am fascinated by the dynamic between David and Guy, and I'm really distressed by David's broad thesis, to be honest. We've got here the arrival of a new government brought into power by a very angry population, frustrated by 20 years of donor dominance, a very passive state, a lot of capacity building. Most of the ideas that are being thrown around by people in this room who've had a lot of influence in Zambia over the years, and it didn't really work, which seemed to be Guy's point. And to me, democracy is the solution to that an angry, frustrated population are saying we want some sort of change. So in this list of 6 things, please let's not hear too much about public financial management systems, poverty reduction, NGO development programs, etc., etc., etc. Zambia has been down that road for a very long time with very disappointing outcomes. So, perhaps some creative thinking.
Okay.
Democracy is the solution I'm offering.
Next to you and then behind you.
I'm Alan Whitworth from DFID, just returned from 4 years in Zambia. I've got at least 3 big things for you. There is massive waste in government expenditure. You mentioned one, the maize purchase. That's just the first on the list. There's even more money is being wasted on the roads sector. The $650 million was spent last year. This year's budget is $900 million. As Gary here will tell you, half of it is going down the drain or down the Zambezi. Mongu Kalabo Road will be one of the great African white elephants people will talk about for years.
If it lasts.
Yeah, especially if it Zambians pay at least 10% more for their fuel than they need to, because the government insists on protecting the highly inefficient Indeni and Tazama monopoly in order to protect 600 jobs at enormous cost. That would have a much greater impact than anything you can do about interest rates. You mentioned the renationalization of Zamtel. The rest of the world has just finished, or just about finished, privatizing their telecoms utilities. Zambia must be the first to renationalize. It's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And please, re-privatize it. I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Well, just those are all kind of negative things, which are really useful. I'm sure Guy will respond. But 300,000 people a year entering the job market, overvalued exchange rate. What else? What's positive that should be done to speed growth?
Well, if you save the money wasted in agriculture and in roads, you can spend that money in providing the services that we've heard are not being provided. If you bring fuel costs down by 10%, that has enormous implications for everyone across the economy. That's really, stop wasting, spend the money productively. There's plenty of ways to spend money productively in Zambia. Social services are still woefully inadequate. but all the benefits are being appropriated by the urban areas.
Okay, thanks. Behind you. Hi.
Sukhwinder Arora, Oxford Policy Management. I've been to Zambia only a few times, so I'm not a Zambia expert like many of you. But I was thinking a useful point to start is, you talked about competent governments and governance. A useful point to start, even on issue like interest rate, is to see what are the transaction costs and risks for both the providers and the users. And of course, interest rates are only one part of the whole story. And if you start unpacking it, you start looking at things like national ID. You talked earlier about titles to land, which makes a huge difference in terms of what collateral you can offer and therefore the risk you are offering to the lender. Other things like credit bureaus. If you start doing small things which are not politically that contentious, there's a huge opportunity here for 4.5 years to build a platform which can be used so that you don't need to pick winners, but you start races.
Okay, very good. That's a very good phrase. The front here. I'm going to let this roll just to get brainstorming ideas for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to you.
Slogans.
Thank you. Edward Tonkin from the Tropical Health and Education Trust. We help with health worker training in Zambia. A lot of people have talked about increasing public sector working and making more robust social services. And one of those that I see in health is the issue of nutrition, which is a very big potential problem to future economic development and education. And it seems that there's a very big opportunity for more public sector employment in that area. It's an area that doesn't really have any place in the Ministry of Health structure or indeed the Ministry of Agriculture. And yet there is massive call in a country with 47% stunting in children for more nutritionists, dietitians, even down to the village level, with more nutrition demonstrators.
Okay, very good. I'm going to take 2 more, or 3, 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and I'd like to ask Richard Jolly, who knows a lot about Zambia, also to comment. Please, Anthony.
Anthony Ellman, Natural Resources Institute and Tropical Agriculture Association. We've talked, is this working? Yeah. We've talked about the difficulties of intensifying smallholder agricultural production because of tenure problems, the difficulty of using subsidies effectively. We've also talked of the problems of large-scale land acquisitions, foreign land acquisitions, land grabs, which tend not to be creating a lot of employment, even if they are serious investors in agriculture. But the potentially big idea, which I want to put, is using these. I have a student who is working in Zambia, attached to the Zambia Land Alliance, which is very hot on small farmer land rights. And she's found a number of foreign investors in agriculture who are talking, at least, whether it'll lead to action remains to be seen, of not just developing large plantations, but using these as centres of services to small farmers in the surrounding area, providing support services and a market for their produce, and including adding value to their produce by processing, storage and marketing. Do you think that there is mileage in this strategy for transforming agriculture in Zambia?
Thank you. Lady at the back, then Adrian, then Richard, and then we'll pause.
Hi, I'm Irene Vag. I'm an independent consultant currently working on governance, displacement, etc. I'm going to try and be proactive, but I'd like to say that in the late 60s, when I was a young undergraduate at the University of Ghana and things were going a little bit wrong, we were told that independent Africa had been propelled into a technological age, and that after time things would settle down, democracy and governance would come in, and then Africa would develop. It makes me sad that, some decades later, I'm still here and we're still talking about the same problem. But not to be negative and to be proactive. I think that I've been talking to people at various levels about how governance and poverty reduction and issues like that. And I think one of the problems that my colleagues and I are identifying is the engagement of the emergent leadership. Those who are currently in power or have authority, in a way, have a mindset that is almost fixed. And in order to effect change, there has got to be a program of strategies that are going to inculcate the ideals of what is good governance, what is good citizenship, what is good financial management in any country. And I'm afraid that has got to start almost sort of at the bottom, but perhaps also at the top, and weigh itself and meet somewhere there. And that really means an investment in education, in social education, economic education, and also the sort of atmosphere that can exist at university and college and sixth form level, where various people from various communities can have discussion, debate with an inculcated approach that my neighbour has an opinion and I have to respect that he has the right to that opinion. Okay. If you want to know more, I'm happy to talk to you, but I think there has got to be a program of good governance for the emergent leadership.
Thank you very much. We'll take 3 more, Adrian and Sir Richard Jolly, and you at the front. If you can keep it to 1.5 minutes each, please.
Okay, thanks very much. Dr. Scott, or let me say Mr. Vice President, because as Vice President we've now got a licence to ask you questions on any topic that's subject to coordination. And so I'll move on to a new one to satisfy Simon's desire for a good idea. It's the questions that count. To satisfy Simon's desire for a good idea, I'll move on to trade policy. Let me remind you that you're not just in Canary Wharf and now in South London, you're also in the EU, and the EU is the past master at subsidising agriculture, especially in the way that small farmers think they're getting most of the subsidies, but in fact it's all being creamed off by barons in places like East Africa and northern France and so on, and Italy too. That's not my question at all. That's an aside comment, but it's got an appreciative groan from Richard Jolly, which is good. My question is the following. In your capital city, you've got the headquarters of COMESA. COMESA is a putative Cape to Cairo association of sovereign states that get together to trade better and eventually to integrate, to move towards closer and closer integration. Trade policy specialists are constantly lamenting in the newspapers today that multilateralism is dead. It's being killed by so-called free trade agreements between bilaterals. Is regional trade cooperation of the COMESA sort that you host the way to go for a country like Zambia, please? Thank you.
Your thought being that it is, presumably.
Most of my time I want to give to Guy, because I'd like to hear his summary. I had my chance 45 years ago to say what I thought was important in Zambia. I just want to give one personal experience. One morning, a young man climbed through the window of the planning office, Guy Scott, as he was known then, and I'm pleased I gave him a job.
Thank you. This way, Richard, the woman in the front here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Alice. I had a question. So you said that one of your priorities was corruption, and as other people have raised, a big issue is sort of lower level accountability corruption issues, like health workers not turning up to work, teachers not coming to teach. And following on from Alistair's point that there have been public finance accountability initiatives, and that hasn't really done much. I was looking at the Ministry of Health's new strategic plan, and that was kind of similar to the MMD's one, you know, talking about public performance and accountability. What is it that PF's going to do differently to kind of get that stuff working? What are the politics of creating accountability at the lower levels?
Thank you. We'll take David first, and then we'll have the last word. This very interesting critique about the model, but looking at this list of things that have been suggested, of which there are now a dozen, which ones are kind of manageable within the political context that you might imagine Zambia has, or more difficult?
I think a moderate level of difficulty, I mean, this idea of service centres for smallholder agriculture, I mean, it sounds to me like the thing to do, and I think Felicity's question implied the idea that if you really want to absorb the labour, you have to do it through smallholder agriculture and not through anything else. But on the other hand, it's a complex organisational task, and I think no government in Zambia is going to be able to carry that off unless it has some consensus with the people who are currently out of power that this is too important to be politicked away. And unfortunately, I mean, having an angry population is no guarantee of good government performance. I mean, I don't think transformative development policies have ever been produced by having an angry electorate. That doesn't do the trick.
Very good. Just start by explaining why you went through the window rather than through the door like everybody else.
Richard seems to remember it very well. I don't remember it at all. So maybe he will.
Window, I was initially shocked and I realised what quality.
I'm afraid that'll just remain
never
a
mind,
mystery.
You've had lots of suggestions. You don't need to respond to all of them, but just take 2 or 3 minutes.
I'm going to ask the High Commissioner, who is the Permanent Secretary of Works and Supply for some years, to tell us, to respond to that point about roads and fuel inefficiencies. Yeah, that's waste in government expenditure. So that you meet them apart from everything else.
Perhaps turn around so that people can see.
I'm glad I'm not a politician. That's how I survived from the former government into this new government under different presidents. I'm a high commissioner, I'm a civil servant. Now, I'm glad you asked about that question, because who was it who asked about? Oh, it's you here. He came to Zambia and, as he said, started a system of labor-based road construction. Now, he came at a time when the World Bank gave us guidelines under the road SIP 1 and 2 on how to carry out road maintenance. It was a World Bank-driven program. Now, we took over 40,000 kilometers of bad roads. You will remember that some people were even saying, if you are driving straight on a Zambian road, then it means you are drunk, because the roads were so bad you had to swerve at every point. Now, the money, therefore, was not sufficient. And we were told how much money to spend in each year. Politicians are difficult people. People in Mongu wanted that Mongu-Kalabo road, direct, across the plain. We were stampeded into procuring that project by the politicians. And you know it now that the Western Province they want to secede. And one of the reasons why they want to secede is because we didn't build sufficient roads. The politicians have got targets to reach. Spread growth throughout the country. And they will tell you, the technocrats, what to do. We wanted a road from Solwezi down to Kasempa. We wanted to open the eastern corridor to go down to Senanga, so that we would go to Namibia. An alternative route, so that the new copper belt could be connected to a new seaport. But we were discouraged by some of your own brothers. The Millennium Challenge, they came to us and told us that that road is not viable. The internal rates of return are not good. And yet a government has a duty to open up the country. So there is a conflict there.
So we're going to have to stop in a minute, but that's a good
Thank
point
you.
to pause.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, that's a fascinating story about the pressures on politicians. Just take a couple of minutes just to round us up. We're supposed to finish at 5:30, so we don't want to go on more than 5 minutes afterwards.
Well, there's quite a large number of points here. And
you
I
say
was,
you've noted them all and think about how you put them together. How about that?
you know, you've been in this game a long time, I can tell that. I think stuff that I can get my teeth into. Commerce. Have we got anyone from Commerce here? Any of my Commerce people, or they all went to Manchester? They all went to Manchester to learn how to set up a co-op. Nutrition, I take the point, except I would warn you that some of the people who are supposed to be stunted are not actually stunted. They're just very small people. They're Bushman blood rather than of Bantu blood, and it's not taken into account. The fuel inefficiency, you got any point on that? I mean, you're right, but I mean, there are practicalities, like if you want to stop re-cracking cracked fuel, which is what we do in Zambia. We crack it in the Middle East and then mix it, send it out to Zambia and re-crack it in some cheap gym cracking machine. You then have to answer the question, how do you stop people stealing it on the way into Zambia down the pipeline? And the answer perhaps is you redeploy the 600 people who are working in the refinery to guard the pipeline, because obviously if you're sending down fuel, petrol followed by diesel followed by kerosene, it's open to be stolen very easily and quickly. Waste and government expenditure generally and controls, I think all that's taken, and I hope we've got notes of all these things. I hope that you won't stop observing, you won't stop talking, you won't stop talking about your standards. I think Richard's point that he asked that he had his say 45 years ago and now he's leaving it to me, is actually very gratifying, because I was with a lot of expatriates from our day, our early days, whooping it up the other day and drinking plenty of wine and whiskey and saying, oh, this place has gone downhill. And I said, don't you think perhaps it's your ideas that made it go downhill? And this sort of struck them as a novel thought. I was a little bit surprised. But anyway, I think we've shot our bolt, at least I have.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I think we've really illustrated the fact that there are no automatic easy answers. I mean, some of these ideas are really, really powerful as ideas, and some of them might even be better than the old ones and are really difficult to implement. And so I think this interaction between you has been completely fascinating. We're going to have drinks in a second, and I'm asked to tell you that you should please recognise that it's busy in there and crowded, so please take a drink and bring it back in here. You've made many good decisions in your life. One of the best may have been to marry a former employee of ODI, so we're delighted that Charlotte is here as well, a great agricultural expert now with a link to IDS. Take the opportunity to talk to her if you can. You've provided a really good contribution, all of you, to a very substantive discussion, so thank you all for your contributions, but please join me in thanking both David and Guy Scott.